Hello, and welcome to another Tip Tuesday tutorial video. Once again, I am NeoQor, and we are here in the studio, and today we're going to talk a little bit about stereo separation. Now, a lot of y'all probably know about stereo separation and like what it is. You may have messed with it a little bit. Today I'm going to show you a way to kind of use it in your mixdowns to improve the quality of your mixdowns, because I don't know if you know, but if you don't use stereo separation right in your mixdown, you don't use it selectively on your different instruments, then you could wind up having a mixdown that sounds a little bit flat. It's going to sound thin, and it's going to sound like everything is in the center of your mix, and there's not going to be any kind of variation in like the location of your sounds. And you're just going to be able to tell when you reference that track and in comparison to like a more professional track, like from one, maybe like a big name artist, like say if you're making hardcore, like you compare, an amateur track with no stereo separation on any instruments to, I don't know, like a track by like Gammer, Searle, any guy who has been doing this for a long time. You're gonna hear a difference. And I noticed that when I first started producing. I was like, why is my stuff not sounding as fat and as wide as these, big guys' tracks? And I realized part of that is because I wasn't really using any stereo separation on any of my instruments. I was just leaving the separation in the middle. And you'll see here these knobs on the mixer. Now, I have a pattern here, which is just a basic drum pattern. I have them all assigned to their own channels on the mixer, each instrument. And you'll see that for each instrument, each instrument's mixer track, you'll see here there's a little knob by the volume fader. This knob in FL controls the stereo separation. So if you go all the way to the left, it's 100% separated. And if you go all the way to the right, it's all 100% merged, which means it's in mono. So this is, if you leave it in the center, let's say you have a sample and you leave this knob in the center, that's going to keep the stereo separation, the stereo image of the sound exactly the same as the original sample. Now, some samples already have some sort of stereo separation or some sort of stereo delay in them. They're recorded that way, but when you're making a track, you don't want to leave all of your stuff at the same, you don't want to leave all of your stuff the same. Like you don't want it to be all in the middle. I typically will leave my kicks in the center. I won't really do much to my kicks. And then I will typically separate out a lot of my hats, my claps, and my snares. So I'll show you what I'm talking about, right? So I'm going to play this loop for you and let you hear what it sounds like without any stereo separation. And then I'm going to do a little bit of work on it. So let's go ahead and play it. So it's pretty basic, it's just a kick, clap, hat, and snare. So we're going to leave the kick alone. I don't really want to do anything to the kick. The clap, I will typically separate out to maybe like anywhere from like 15 to like 20, anywhere from like 15 to 30%. You don't want to go too crazy with this. You don't want to separate everything way out. Of course you can with some instruments. It really just depends on where you want your mix to be in the stereo field. So we'll do that, and I'm just going to isolate the kick and the clap. And compare that to the clap with no stereo separation. I'll put it back in the middle there. Let me separate it back out. Right? So then we're going to go to the hats. And you can hear the hat. Let me just play the kick and the hat. There's a little bit of stereo separation on that hat already. You can hear a little tiny bit of a stereo delay, but it still sounds like it's really in the center of the mix. And that's not really what we want. I want to leave the center of the mix open to primarily my kick and my bass. You know, that's really the only thing I want completely like dead center. Even the bass line, like, you know, if you've seen my tutorial videos on bass lines and kicks and all that kind of stuff, anything with that's like a bass heavy sound, I'll typically layer that, and I'll have a higher end layer that's providing like kind of the sizzle or the crunch to the sound, and that the sound with a lot of the high end in it will typically be separated a little bit, whereas the pure like bass tone layer will be either just in the original setting, it'll just be right in the middle, 12 o'clock, or it'll be 100% to mono. And so let me go ahead and let's go about 10, 12%. And keep in mind, these numbers are just guidelines. This is kind of the neighborhood that I work in. It's not an exact science. You really just kind of have to, when you're working on a mix, you kind of have to season to taste. I say that a lot, but because it's true, you have to season to taste. You have to, you know, listen to your mix and kind of gauge where you want everything to be based on how it sounds. But let's go ahead and play it, and I'm going to do some adjusting. Yeah, you may not really hear much of a difference, but it definitely does have a bit of an effect. It's very subtle, though. But these are the little things you have to do to make your mix sound more professional. You know, it's those little changes that really make all the difference. So let me go to the snare now. So we've got the clap is it's separated way out, and I should have said this in the very beginning of the video. So basically, what stereo separation is and what it does is, it's like panning. Panning is, you know, moving your sound to the left or to the right. So basically, what stereo separation is, if you think of your sound being, you know, pretty much in the middle of your mix, and think of your mix as a stage. You know, it can be right in the middle. And then if you separate it out, your mix coming out of the left side and the right side of the stereo signal, it's going to be panned further left and further right. So it's going to be further left in the left channel and then further right in the right channel. So it's going to sound like, the way we perceive it, it's going to sound like it's, you know, wider, like it's further apart, like it, you know, it's not going to, and that in turn creates more room for your kick and your bass and your sounds that you want to have in the middle. Because if you think of all your sounds as instruments on a stage, and you think of your stereo field as the placement of your instruments on that stage, and you have all of your instruments right in the center of the stage, then they're all going to be in each other's way, and they're going to be fighting for that room to come through. It's the same thing with, you know, mixing your volume levels. You want to have headroom, just as when you're mixing your stereo field, you want each thing to kind of have its own place so that it'll come through more clearly. So that's basically what we're doing, is we're giving each of these instruments kind of its own place in the stereo field and its own kind of stereo separation. So the snare I'm going to kind of match to the clap, because I want the snare and the clap. In this case, I want the snare and the clap to be kind of like layers. So the clap is about 30. We'll go ahead and we're not going to give the snare the exact same separation, but we'll put it close. We'll put it kind of in the same neighborhood. So the clap is about 33, and the snare is about, well, the snare's, okay, we'll give the snare 28. We'll see how that sounds. Yeah, and already there's a difference there. And another thing you can do, not just stereo separation, but you can make stereo delays using, in Fruity Loops, there's a plugin called Stereo Enhancer. And this thing also has a knob for stereo separation on this plugin, but I don't really use that on this plugin because I just use the one that's on the mixer. It's just easier that way for me. The really only thing I use on the stereo enhancer is the phase offset, which basically creates a delay, a time delay between like the left side and the right side of or the left channel and the right channel of the sound. So there's a little bit of a delay between it comes out of the left speaker and when it comes out of the right speaker. And you can pan it, you can set it to where it'll come out of the right first and the left next, or the left first and the right next. And it just kind of affects the way it sounds, and it also just affects the like, I don't know, like the placement of the sound. It makes the sound wider and fatter to the human ear because it's such a quick time difference. We still perceive it as one sound, but they're kind of, you know, separated in time, so it just makes it sound like it's a wider sound. It's really a psychological thing, but it really makes a difference in helping your tracks and your instruments sound a lot more professional and a lot wider. So we'll go ahead and do that with the clap. So I just gave that a delay of 0.8 milliseconds to the right, and already you can hear the clap is you know, it's got a wider stereo field. Now keep in mind, this is not what I just did. That's not stereo separation, that's stereo delay. So there's a difference. There's stereo separation, which is more like panning further out to the left and to the right both ways at once, and then there's the phase offset, which is like a time offset between the left and the right. Both have a bit of a similar effect. They both you can use to achieve a similar purpose, but they have different effects and they work differently, so just keep that in mind. They're not the exact same thing. The hat, we're going to put a stereo enhancer on this as well. And again, you want everything to have its own place, so I'm not going to put the exact same delay setting on every single instrument, right? So for the hat, let's go just a little bit to the left with it and see how that sounds. So I went about 1.4 milliseconds to the left with the hat, and the snare we can kind of match to the clap, because again, you know, my personal taste for this example, I want the snare and the clap to kind of be layers of each other since they're both playing at the same time. So I'm gonna set the snare to be similar to the clap, but not the exact same. Right. So now you hear the difference, right? There's a bit more width, a bit more of a, you know, wider sound. Everything now the mix is starting to sound, it's got life. It's got, you know, it's got depth. It doesn't just sound like a thin little flimsy, you know, track. It's really hard to explain, but again, it's all psychological, and like these little things make a huge difference, right? And you can do the same thing with your instruments too. Like I'll go ahead and drop a instrument in here so you can hear what I'm talking about. So I'll just set a preset here, and I'll just make a little riff. So go ahead and put some delay on this just for fun, some reverb, because I don't like that dry sound. It just bothers me, you know. Everything's got to be wet. It's got to be moist. So now, yeah, so you see how it's kind of, you know, it's kind of weak. And what I'll typically do in my leads is I'll add a chorus. That's also kind of a version of stereo delay, basically creating a delay in time between the left and the right channel. It basically makes it sound wider. It makes it sound like there's two of them, or like there's more voices at once. So we will go ahead and for the leads I'll sometimes pan those way out to like 30, 40, 50, because again, with hardcore and hardstyle, especially with hardstyle, your kick is going to take up a good portion of the center area in your stereo field. Like, you'll have your kick, you'll have your bass, which will be mono, which will be right dead in the center, and then your your what is it? Your sorry, I'm gonna brain fart here. Your crunch layer, which is gonna be part of your kick, but that's gonna be more like the high end. It's gonna be panned out. Well, not panned out. It's gonna be separated out a little bit more. So that kick is gonna have, it's gonna have some, some fatness to it. It's gonna have some separation on it. So you want your leads to kind of be further out so that they're not competing in the stereo field with the kick. So sometimes I'll separate my leads out as far as like 50%. It just depends. And I won't separate my leads out to the same exact settings either. I'll have one closer to the center, and I'll have one, maybe like, kind of between the other one. I'll have one that's like one layer that's like really far out. So that also helps your leads sound more fat when you have different layers and they're all kind of set to different parts of the stereo field. So let's go ahead and see what this sounds like. You can even put stereo enhancers on your leads. I don't typically do this, but I guess maybe we'll see what it does. So yeah, you can do that. I kind of have a pretty long delay on that. It helps. I think it does something. I wouldn't do this on all of my lead layers though. But yeah, so that's pretty much stereo separation. You wanna do this to most of your sounds. You don't want to just very few you want to leave in the center. Like the only ones I'll typically leave in the center, I've said this probably like a million times, the kick and the bass. And with the bass, like you can separate out your bass layers differently too. Like I wouldn't leave if I have a bass line with multiple layers, I wouldn't leave all of them in the center of the stereo field. I would separate out the higher ends a little bit. And then even like if I'm mastering a track, stereo separation can even be used in mastering. Like Maximus, that's the wrong plugin. God dang it. Oh, forgive me. But in Maximus, there we go. So Maximus has a feature where this is a multi-band compressor. I'm not going to go too much into depth on this plugin in particular, but like Maximus, if you set, let me go to default. There's a low band, there's a mid band, there's a high band. Basically, there's you set the frequencies of these bands for your low frequencies, your mid range, and your highs on your master channel, and then for each band you can have a separate stereo separation. So for the low band, I'll typically keep the low band to just like the pure like bass tones when I'm mastering a track, and then I'll set that band to mono with this thing here, this knob here. And then the mid, I'll separate out maybe like 8%, 9%. And then the high, I'll separate out maybe like 16 or so percent. And the master, I'll just leave the same because, that's still everything. I don't want to separate all the lows. But yeah, for each band, you can set it to a different stereo width. So That's pretty cool. You can do that even when you're mastering. Even in Ozone, I have Ozone 8 Elements, which I use for mastering. There's a stereo imager on this thing, and you can, set the stereo width on this when you're mastering just a little bit, just widen it out a little bit. I'll typically do that when I'm, mastering a track. I'll just bump it up a little bit. But yeah, so stereo separation, really important throughout the entire process. Not just when you're mixing down, but even when you're mastering. Like it doesn't stop in the mix down, but the mix down is your most important part, right? Because that's when you're getting everything to a point where it's ready to be mastered. So just, try different settings out with different instruments, and see what you can get, and just notice the difference. Like I recommend taking a track that you haven't done any stereo separation to on any instruments, and then making a new version of that track, and then doing everything, like stereo separating everything out the way you want it, and then bouncing them both down, and then like comparing them side by side. Like listen to the difference. When you have everything set to a certain setting in the stereo field versus no stereo separation whatsoever, it makes a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. So try this. If you're not doing this already, you should be doing it. And that's really all else I have to say on this topic. If you want to know more about this, reach out to me via email or DM me on Facebook or Instagram. That's NeoQor on Facebook, official NeoQor on Instagram. Email is neoqor@gmail.com. And with that, this is the end of today's Tip Tuesday tutorial. I hope that you have found this video valuable, and I look forward to joining you again next week. Bye-bye.